Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. I know waiting, I don't know if anybody from Hong Kong will be joining. I know that they have registered, so I don't know what to say there. Good night, maybe? Not yet. We're Glenview Group, and we're very excited to welcome you to our R2v3 webinar. And Mike Easterbrook is going to be the lead on this webinar, and he's also going to be talking to Sean from SERI. We're going to learn a little bit more about the timelines and kind of probe any questions that we have, if we have any, for clarification. Just some housekeeping that Asal already mentioned. If you can please keep yourself on mute unless you have a question. You can either put your screen into gallery mode or speaker mode. I personally like the speaker mode. I think that the chat icon is on the bottom screen, so you can chat those questions as well. And with that said, I am going to give it to Mike, and he can take over. And I will shut off my camera now. Talk to you soon.
All righty. Well, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. My name's Mike Easterbrook from Glenview Group, and this is our fourth day of our webinar marathon. So far this week, we've talked about returning to work amid the COVID-19 pandemic and various ISO standards. And I have to say that today I'm most excited about, R2v3, the standard about used electronics and the used electronic recycling industry is my background and expertise and experience. So I'm very excited and going to geek out in a similar way that Maya's going to geek out this afternoon with aviation and defense quality management systems. So hope you enjoy and can stick around for that. So today we're talking about R2v3, the sustainable electronic reuse and recycling standard. So here's a roadmap of today's presentation. We're going to talk about what is R2, the general timeline of where R2 has come from and where it is today, and give a brief introduction to R2v3 in terms of the requirement overview, and talk a bit with Sean Vries, the R2 director, on timelines. So R2 is one of the first worldwide standards designed specifically for electronic refurbishers and recyclers. Before that, we had Rios 2006, which was pretty much for every recycler, paper, metal, cardboard, electronics, but it wasn't specific to the electronic reuse and recycling industry. So R2 is very specific to those things. And this standard standardizes industry practices for environmental health and safety and data security requirements applicable in the electronics reuse and recycling industry. So there's a special focus on the reusability and repair of used electronics, and also end-of-life electronic recycling and responsible downstream management of recycled materials, the whole hierarchy of the R2 standard. So a little bit of history about the R2 standard. Back in 2008, R2 Solutions published the first responsible recycling standard, and that was made up of a coalition of EPA, people like manufacturers, OEMs, and state agencies, interest group like SERI, all came together to kind of build this standard together, and that's what they published under R2 Solutions. Then in 2010, SERI was formed to host the R2 standard, and the second version of R2 was published in 2013. After R2 2013 was published, a lot of growth happened in terms of the standard, and there's more than 800 certified recyclers in over 31 countries. So it's grown substantially over the years. It's become pretty much the baseline for operating in the industry. You look at people who are doing business, and most of them who are doing business in the industry are certified to a certain extent. So this next iteration of the standard R2v3 was first published in 2019, and there was over 500 public comments, which the SERI Technical Advisory Committee, or TAC, responded to, made revisions as necessary, and released this second draft. The second draft was released a little earlier this year, and then there was a time for public comment again, and the TAC made necessary revisions from that and finished their revisions and have now submitted the final draft to SERI's board of directors for approval and ANAB and all that kind of stuff. Formalities, you know. So version 3, as I said, first draft in 2019. It's currently the second draft, which has become the final draft, and the effective date will be determined at a later time. Sean might be able to give us a little more information, but I think a lot of that is still pending a few things. So the structure of this standard, both the R2 2008 and 2013 standards were very similar in that they were made up of 13 provisions. But now the standard is a very much different structure in a way. It's made up of 2 sections. Section 1 is the 10 core requirements, and that doesn't mean that there's 3 less provisions or core requirements. It just means that those 13 provisions are now kind of embedded in 10 core requirements. Some have changed. There has been, you know, just a consolidation of some of those requirements into the 10 core requirements. And section 2 is made up of the R2 process requirement, in Appendix A through F. So we'll talk a little bit more when we get to that about what the process requirements are, but if you're conducting a process at your facility, then you'll be also required to conform to the requirements in section 2. There's also the R2 equipment categorization, or REC for short, and it's a reference document used in conjunction with the standard. So it's a classification of materials. When I say materials, I mean electronic equipment, components, and materials. I'm just shortening it for the sake of this presentation. But the REC is also an auditable document as necessary. So the R2 equipment categorization, it's new to version 3 here, and it's used in conjunction with the standard. And it's a framework for evaluating electronic equipment, components, and materials, and it must be incorporated into the organization's process and procedures. Here's my very simplified summary of what the REC is about. So I'm talking about R2 controlled streams, which is basically used electronic equipment that falls under the scope of the standard in terms of electronic equipment. And the basic categories that need to be identified is the material data bearing. If so, does it still contain data? Is it reusable? If so, has it been evaluated? And what is the functional and cosmetic conditions? And is it an FM or is it FM bearing? That is a very simplified overview of the REC, and there's much more to it. This is kind of just a kind of high level look at some of the things, the main concepts within the REC. So starting with the R2 core requirements, are there any questions regarding the REC that I can answer? Okay, I'll move into the R2 core requirements. So the first core requirement is scope. So this applies to all materials. Again, materials from now on means electronic equipment, components, and materials. All the materials managed and all the processes performed need to be included in the scope. So the process requirements in section 2 will be on the R2v3 certification. along with legal entities associated with the certifiable activities, any other DBAs that are operating or within the scope of that business, and R2 facility, online store names, stuff that may be pertinent to the scope of that R2 facility. And the R2 facility needs to communicate periodically. That could be on their website or through some other means. It doesn't necessarily give a specific way. It says they need to communicate periodically additional locations that aren't R2 certified. Core requirement, 2 is the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. So you have to have a written policy on management of used and end-of-life electronic equipment, components, and materials. For outsourcing or off-site facilities, written process on selection of downstream vendors. So this is not really much change from the previous provision 2. We get the whole R2 hierarchy of reuse is the highest and most beneficial way to manage used electronics, and then material recovery, and then finally disposal. And a new thing to the hierarchy of responsible management strategies is that there's both the management of focused materials versus non-focused materials. So whereas energy recovery, incineration, and land disposal are still prohibited unless required by law or unless there's extreme and rare circumstances, non-focused materials can be sent there, but you have to exhaust all reuse and recovery options and try to find the most energy beneficial option of energy recovery, incineration, or land disposal, for that non-focused material. So any questions about that? A non-focused material would be like plastic, metals. Core requirement number 3 is the environmental health and safety management system. So organizations must be certified by an accredited certification body to SERI approved EHS standards. So that could be ISO 45001. OSOS is going away in March 2021. It's on the list, but it's going away soon enough. ISO 14001 and RIOS 2016. So under core requirement 3, see, I still talk about provisions. I need to get into the language of saying core requirements. Under core requirement 3, EH&S management system, you have to be able to demonstrate the expertise, knowledge, and technical capability to process material in compliance and protective of occupational health and safety, the community, neighbors, and the environment. So this is something that is new to R2v3. This is something that wasn't in 2013. Also, you have to have effective controls for your important or significant aspects and hazards that the facility, R2 facility, can control or influence. So this might be some external facilities. It might be the facilities that are non-R2 certified, or it might even extend to some of your downstream vendors, depending on the activity and the scope of your management system. And you have to periodically evaluate the risk of exposure to hazardous substances, mercury, lead, phosphor compounds. There's a few other in there, but you have to be able to, it doesn't say necessarily test, but periodically evaluate the risk of exposure. So some facilities that don't handle those types of things might not test for it, whereas other facilities that have that present would want to test to see what exposure levels are. Core requirement 4 is legal and other requirements. So organizations must comply with all applicable environmental health and safety, data security, and legal requirements. It's very similar to provision 3, but there's a little bit more here too. So looking at import and export requirements and transit requirements, including domestic and international, and developing a compliance plan that would identify legal requirements and associated offsite activities. So a non-R2 facility that is owned by the entity that is certified might be applicable here. Identify and implement controls to ensure compliance and periodically audit with a competent auditor. So comply with notification requirements. You also have to notify the CBs within 30 days of receiving regulatory orders of notice or violation. I guess there should be some a new to V3 on this one, but we could have pretty much done that on every slide then. Another portion of core requirement 4 is prohibiting the use of child labor or forced labor, or prohibiting the use of prison labor unless voluntary and compensated beyond room and board, and their skills that are taught for gainful employment, and have a documented non-discrimination policy. So there's a lot more in the legal and other requirements than there were in the previous standard. Core requirement 5 is tracking throughput, and this has also increased because you have to track and manage throughput of electronic equipment and components inbound, in process, and outbound. So you have to be able to maintain records and summary reports, and also maintain for both inbound and outbound, have the summary reports, and maintain total inventory levels below legal requirements, and also your closure plan and financial instrument that's in place. So if you have rows and rows of CRTs triple stacked, there might be an issue that you have with the fire department and the high pile permits, and also you're beyond the capability of what you stated that you are storing in your closure plan, then the financial instrument wouldn't cover the cost of that. Also, another thing about tracking throughput is that you can't store stuff for more than a year if it has a negative value. So most of the time, stuff with a negative value has some type of waste and probably is required by regulations to be disposed or removed of within a year anyways. However, there might be situations where this is not necessarily applicable. Any questions on that? And Asal, you could jump in and stop me if there's a question and I don't stop at the end of the slide. I know that I haven't been doing that, so apologize.
I will.
Okay. So R2 core requirement 6 is sorting, categorization, and processing. So there's a documented process for evaluation, sorting, and categorization. And this includes stuff from the rec and identifying data storage devices. Is it data bearing? Yes or no? Does it still contain data, or is it sanitized? So you might have an instance where you have a hard drive come in and it was going to be go through the data wipe process, but it failed data wipe and needs to now go to physical shredding either at your facility or downstream. So it's a data bearing device, and all because it failed the data wipe, it's still data bearing, so it's not sanitized at the moment. So these new categorizations are big changes from what we had before in 2013, and it's gonna, depending on the size of the facility, it might be a little bit more challenging for some of the smaller organizations to conform to these requirements that don't have a sophisticated software. It will be interesting to see the ways that these facilities conform to these requirements here. So equipment capable of reuse must be identified with a unique identifier and tested in accordance with Appendix C, which is the test and repair portion, transferred to downstream in accordance with Appendix A if it's not able of reuse, the downstream recycling chain, or process in accordance with Appendix D, which is a specialty electronic reuse, and that's probably very minimal. There was a portion in Provision 6 that talked about specialty and collectible electronics, but I think that was used by very few electronic recyclers. Okay, continuing with core requirement 6 here, equipment not capable of reuse shall be processed in accordance with material recovery, Appendix E, and transferred to a downstream vendor in accordance with Appendix A. Provision 7 is data security, and this is a lot more in depth than the previous provision 8 of data destruction. So documents, you have to document and maintain a data sanitization plan with various requirements. That's not different. Under the old standard, you still needed to have a documented procedure for data sanitization or data destruction, and define data containing devices when sorting, define and secure storage areas, methods used for data sanitization. So different types of electronic equipment might require different methods of sanitization, and maintain records that demonstrate effectiveness of data sanitization. So continuing with core requirement 7 here, we also document and maintain the data security policy, have access controls, assign a data protection representative, and this similar to on the organizational chart, how you often identify the management rep. This could be the operations manager, it could be the supervisor of the reuse or data destruction area, whoever's appropriate and qualified to kind of oversee the data destruction or data sanitization processes along with data security and all that can be designated as that person. It doesn't need to be a separate individual. New things to this data security requirement are reporting of known and suspected breaches to the data protection representative, and training and confidentiality agreements prior to handling data-bearing equipment. So training was required under 2013, but confidentiality agreements were not. Non-compliance penalties. So people who are not following this could have a certain element of personal liability, which is very interesting. Core requirement 8 is focus materials. So focus materials includes both the on-site management and down through the recycling chain to end of life. The new requirement in this is both the non-focus material requiring specific management. Before we had print cartridges, ink cartridges, and toner as part of that, but non-electronic material in accordance with core requirement 2. So core requirement 9 is facility requirements. There's really a lot there. I've really summarized it and shortened it down to kind of give a high level view. There's a lot to unwrap and really figure out how we're going to conform best to these new requirements here. So process and storage in a legally compliant manner, indoor processing or storage if possible, or show it that it's compliant to do it outdoors. Protect from uncontrolled release into the environment and labeled as appropriate. Also, the facility should do an evaluation of risk, which includes changes to the operation or volume of material, insurance for liability, and a closure plan, including a financial instrument. The closure plan is not required if it would cost less than $10,000 to clean up the facility, or the facility is less than 1,000 square meters, and the facility doesn't accept mercury, CRT, lithium, primary, or PCBs. So some small places that do cell phone refurbishing might fall within this, and there might be some other facilities that fall within this, but you know, it's not, or all of these things must be met. The last core requirement is transport. So packaged, transported material appropriately, special requirements for transport of equipment that contains data. So that's something that's new here, and adhere to core requirement 4 and have accurate codes for shipping. And there's a little bit more description in the wording of the standard there. But there's no longer the requirement to to look at safer and get 3 years of safety records. But there's other requirements that would make sure that, transporters are doing things in accordance with legal requirements and being done safe. So now we're out of the core requirements and going to section 2 of R2v3, which is the process requirements. So the process requirements are made up of appendices A through F. So the process requirements here, if the R2 facility is conducting an activity and process in section 2, it must be added as part of their scope. So as you go through these, you'll see that a lot of these are probably might be applicable to your operation. And as I was thinking about it, a lot of these things are that I see in a lot of our clients. They're probably going to be have to conform to a lot of the appendix here. So Appendix A is the downstream recycling chain. So this is basically just the approval of downstream vendor qualification. Almost every facility is doing that has any type of, if you have 100% reuse, which is very unlikely, then you might not have to do this. But most people have some type of waste or some type of downstream vendor qualification. So you have to consider transboundary movements, transparency, and downstream vendor qualifications. So the R2 certified facilities versus non-R2 certified facilities, under the R2v3, it becomes much easier if you're working with the R2 downstream vendor, because the downstream due diligence kind of stops at that point once you get to the first R2 certified facility. However, for non-R2 certified downstream vendors, it's going to be pretty challenging to approve them. And I think that there's pros and cons to that. It makes a level playing field and kind of puts the standard. If we want to have this R2 standard kind of adhere to and the best practices for our industry, then it makes sense that working with non-R2 certified downstreams will become difficult, and that there would be a benefit to working with R2 certified downstream vendors. There might be only a blockage to certain business avenues, but in those times you have to consider what's best in accordance with the requirements of the standard and what's more important to you. Appendix B is looking at data sanitization. A lot of facilities deal with data sanitization, so they're going to have to be conforming to Appendix B here. It talks about traceability, training, physical sanitization, logical sanitization, and quality control. Appendix C talks about testing, quality management system certification for test and repair. So those who are certified to that also have to be certified to a quality management system. You define test and quality assurance plans and product return policy. A lot of the similar ideas to Provision 6, but there's things in there that are more beefed up. Appendix D is specialty electronics, which is something that probably very few R2 facilities will have as part of their scope and process requirements here. But there are some, and for those facilities, you have to show the competency of technicians, the testing and verification requirements of those specialty electronics, and there's certain requirements in terms of what is stated in the purchase order for the sale of these specialty electronics. Appendix E is process for material recovery and management of focused materials. So a lot of facilities, if you're doing any type of dismantling, breaking electronic equipment down to the component or commodity level, then you're going to have to adhere to Appendix E. You're already doing a hazard identification and removing focused materials, process recovery and treatment of focused materials, but there's a lot more here in terms of assurance for environmental incidents and continued processing. There's quite a bit of information in Appendix E, and there's several things that will need to be done to change or to conform your existing system from 2013 to R2v3 if you're a material recovery facility. Appendix X is the brokering requirement. So the R2 requirement applies to brokered material. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the people who have this are only brokers. It could also be an R2 facility that has full-on material recovery or reuse, but they're just brokering a deal. So the definition of brokering activities is that controlling the delivery directly to a downstream vendor without physically handling the material. I took that from the R2 standard. I kind of shortened it and made it a little bit more precise. You might want to read the full definition in the R2 standard. And under Appendix F, you also have to be certified to a quality management system. So for the R2 controlled streams, there are more requirements. You have to make sure that it adheres to legal requirements, tracking throughput, storage requirements, data security, and so on. So any questions? We kind of went through section 1 and 2, the core requirements and the process requirements. I wanted to introduce Sean and then have a discussion with him in regards to the timeline, or let him speak on that. And if I have any questions, ask him after he's done speaking. But Sean Vries is the R2 director. He's responsible for providing technical expertise and guidance for the application and implementation of the R2 standard and educating various stakeholders on the R2 requirements. So Sean leads the R2 development process of R2v3, which is now complete. So congratulations there, and is almost complete, I should say. And also work closely with the TAC throughout the whole R2 process. He has a considerable amount of experience in standards development and oversight for the reuse and recycling industry. So good afternoon, Sean. How are you doing?
I'm Mike, doing well, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. So would you like to share a little bit about the timeline? I know it's changing and fluid.
Yeah, absolutely. And first, thanks for the run through on that, and sharing this information. As you've indicated, there's a lot here. This is a shortened down version, and individuals will have to go through the text themselves. But certainly, we're going to be providing extra resources, extra training as well from SERI's point of view. We're working through some of that now. We're going to try to get that information out there as soon as we can, as soon as that's available. You'll see a new website soon. So we have a lot of things in the works that we're going to be publishing and getting out there, so supporting resources. And that's going to be our work with the TAC in the near term as we move forward as well, to get some of those resources and get their feedback on those. So hopefully they're targeted well to the industry. Now, having said that, as you indicated, the standard's been approved by the consensus body. We're going through the kind of final formalities now. I think I'm hoping we'll have an announcement soon that we'll be able to release to everybody on formal adoption of the standard. And, so what we're looking at right now when we're trying to kind of devise what this transition timeline looks like, mainly, and what we want to reflect is we understand the global situation right now that's happening with the pandemic, the effects that that's having on organizations. So as you indicated, Mike, even as since we talked last week, we've adjusted the timeline a little bit. And so
Sure.
this is based on what we're anticipating, I'll say. So not in stone, but we anticipate a 3-year transition plan for the new standard. And as you folks know, it's pretty typical with standards. They're often on a 3-year cycle. And so it works well to do a transition over that time period as well. So we anticipate kind of 3 years from the release date, then the 2013 standard would expire, and every certificate, every R2 approval would need to be to the V3 standard. So if we kind of go back from there, there's a couple of keep paths. And for those organizations that aren't currently certified, they may be working on certification now. They may be in that process to the 2013 standard. And so we recognize that. And what we'll likely see is probably a 6-month kind of transition for those folks once we release the standard to say, you can continue down that 2013 path to finalize that. But again, the certification date or length for that would still expire within that 3 years. So it wouldn't be able to go past that 3-year timeline. Now, for organizations that are in process or sort of currently certified, they would have to be doing a recertification. What we're anticipating is probably a 1.5-year kind of transition. So nobody would have to redo their certification or upgrade to the V3 version prior to a 1.5 years. And then as your certification comes due, they would need to be rolling over to that new standard. Now, we know some organizations are interested in doing it sooner as well, so we anticipate that there will be an opportunity to do that. So hopefully balancing that work out and that audit load as well over that 3-year period.
Okay, that sounds very good. Thank you, Sean. I appreciate it. Asal or Maya, do you have any questions or comments for Sean? Or
hi, yes, I actually have a question specific to the training of the auditors. I think you already started training some of the auditors, but in terms of really having certifications bodies ready to come in and start auditing, what is that timeline and how does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. That's going to be a critical element to this. And one of the reasons why certifications for the R2 facilities needs to be extended out a little bit is because we have to focus on the certification bodies first. They need to upgrade and have their accreditation upgraded for the standard. And so part of that is the auditor training, and that is the reason that we had started that process already kind of over the past year. And so R2 auditors have already received preliminary training on the draft version of the standard. We have to have a gap update that the auditors will get for any of the changes that happen in the interim, and a refresher as well on the standard. So we'll be rolling that out. We had anticipated to do some live sessions of that, and of course we're not able to do that now. So we'll probably be looking at electronic versions, something like you're doing here today, to do upgrade training for the auditors. Certification bodies will go through their process, and then they'll be ready to start auditing to that standard as well.
thank you. So any other questions or points of discussion that you guys have? Please let us know. Our webinar marathon does continue later today at 2 p.m. with AS 9100, which is the quality management system for the aviation industry. And tomorrow at 11 will be the last presentation on ISO 13485, which is the quality management system for the medical industry. And tentatively, we have, I guess this all depends on what the state of the world is in December, but we have R2v3 training in Pasadena. It's going to be both internal auditor training for R2v3 with Sarah Smart of SERI there, as well as Maya and I doing internal auditor training on 45001 and implementation and skills presentation as well. So we'll be able to help you update your policies and procedures and get everything ready. And it's kind of be a power week of various classes and training. Anything else to add to that, Maya?
No, that's all. We've already have the venue scheduled. It all depends really on the situation, but and if this doesn't happen because of the situation, and because if we're still in, under stay-at-home orders, and depending on how many, individuals can gather, we can also design this to be a virtual, meaning online training as well. And we'll work with that with SERI as well in terms of the internal auditor training we have them scheduled to do for that week. But if you have any questions, feel free to contact us, and we will be rolling out more of that information in June.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sean, for joining us today and discussing the timeline with us. We really appreciate that and taking your time to do that. So thank you.
Thank you. And as other questions come up, and please feel free to reach out at any time.
Thanks. So here's our contact information as well. If you have any additional questions at any time, you guys can contact us by email, and we'll answer those questions. A PowerPoint or a PDF, excuse me, of this presentation will be sent to all those who are in attendance and have an email address, unless Asal needs anybody's email address who is on the call but hasn't necessarily. Okay, hello. I see a question here. A closure plan approved by the local competent authority suffice for R2v3. The short answer is it depends. I think it needs to be looked at individually to see if it's conforming to the requirements. But it likely would if a government entity is approving a closure plan. It probably adheres to the requirements that are in R2v3. But I wouldn't give it a blanket yes. I would say we need to look at it and make an assessment of whether or not it conforms to the requirements. All righty. Well,
question, Mike. I wanted to ask about I would say maybe satellite locations. Do all of the locations have to be taken into consideration within certification, or the organization can choose addresses and or locations to certify?
You can choose locations and addresses to certify, but you also have to, as part of the scope, disclose periodically or communicate the ones that are non-R2 certified.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. And under the scope, one of the key things that we're trying to do there is ensure that it's clear what is certified and what is not. And so the scope includes everything that facility controls. So you don't necessarily have to have a blanket certification across the entire company. But if you have other sites outside of that facility, such as a collection point, a warehouse, other areas that you're controlling and managing that electronic equipment, components or materials, then those need to be part of that scope.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I hope this was informative and helpful, and hope to talk to you all soon. Take care.